Thank you for coming and welcome. My name is John Holler, and I represent the Institute for Advanced Study. We're happy to sponsor Diane Negra as a Branigin lecturer this semester. The Institute for Advanced Study promotes primarily three main programs. It's Branigin Lecture Series, which has brought outstanding scholars and speakers here to campus all year and every year. And we just don't put the Branigin stamp on anyone, Diane. So you passed all the tests and all the credentials. We're delighted to have you here today. The Institute also sponsors competition for new and multidisciplinary seminars on campus to link value faculty with scholars from all over the world. And it funds a program of visiting collaborations or visiting fellows. And if you go to the website for the Indiana University Institute for Advanced Study, you'll see full descriptions of all these programs, photographs of all our Branigin lecturers, and a photograph of Diane, which I guess you can download if you want, as remembrance of her talk. Well, they haven't heard you speak yet. Brenda Weber of Communication and Culture will now introduce our speaker. Brenda, I turn it over to you. Gender studies, I'm sorry. But if it were treated along the disciplines, it would be very easy.
So, wow, it's really terrific to have so many people here. I apologize for the smallness of the room, and I'm really delighted by how overflowing we are, actually. And I think that you're really in for a treat because Diane is really one of the leaders in terms of talking about postfeminism. She's got 2 movies out on postfeminism, an anthology that she edited with Tasker called Interrogating Postfeminism that came out in 2007 with Duke, and then a monograph that she brought out last fall with Routledge called What a Girl Wants.
Fantasizing, the Reclamation of self-esteem.
Subtitles very important. So Diane is a professor of film studies and screen culture at University College Dublin, and she is a prominent scholar who is actually now upwards into her 5th book that she's developing. So you'll see her name in all of the journals and across all of the scholarship that's being done right now on contemporary media and feminist theory. I invite you to, Google her or consult the many flyers that we sent out to advertise this talk to get a sense of the broad range of the topics that she discusses. So I just want to spend my brief time talking a little bit about things that I have actually come to know about Diane. First is that she's an incredibly gracious colleague. One of the most serious conference attenders I know, who actually goes to sessions and seeks out people, and it's entirely to her credit that I have gotten to know her because she came to a session of mine and was very gracious and kind to me in a moment when I really appreciated having that support. Also, a very helpful interlocutor. We all went to, well, not we all, a group of grad students across gender studies, American studies, cultural studies, and communication and culture went to a movie last night with Diane, and then we went out with cocktails afterwards because it seemed the post-feminist thing to do. And we took the conversation train around the table, and all the students got to talk with Diane about their topics of interest, and it was really great to have this, world authority giving them feedback on their topics. I thought that was really helpful. She's a networker extraordinaire and a really excellent and cogent writer about some very difficult and theoretical topics. And I will say that she is also a terrific house guest and a good friend, and my dog couldn't be happier. So without further ado, Diane Negra.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Brenda and to John and to everyone else for facilitating this visit to Bloomington. And I'm really happy to be here. And little did I know you'd have the exact same weather that we have in Dublin. That came as a bit of a surprise. But I'm very happy to be here. I've really enjoyed, especially the graduate students that I've met. And I thought maybe I'd just start with a few explanations, if you like, of what these remarks are going to try to do, and maybe a little bit of what they're not going to do. This is going to be a fairly polemical talk. It's not exactly new research, because as Brenda mentioned, I've already put out 2 books on postfeminism, but it seems like I can't quite leave the chick flick alone. And I've been approached by a publisher lately about doing a book on exactly the chick flick. And my last book was going to be on the chick flick, and it kind of is, but it also delved into female-centered TV genres and print culture and stardom and celebrity and other things, because I think that you can't really isolate the chick flick. It's so conversant with other media forms. But what I'm going to do today then is maybe just give you some of the state of my current thinking about the chick flick, particularly in light of the cinematic releases of 2008. Now, I'm going to probably take some license at times. I probably move into 2009, and I'm sure I'll mention a few films from earlier than 2008. But it struck me that 2008 was a particularly interesting year for the chick flick. And so these remarks are kind of working at 2 levels. They're partly designed for those people who watch chick flicks. And let's face it, that's everybody, whether you want to admit it or not. It's pretty hard to avoid these films. And secondly, also to film studies. And partly what I'm thinking over here is, what film studies might take up in looking more seriously at the chick flick than I think it has tended to do so far. It strikes me that this is perhaps the most high profile and most commercially significant form of filmmaking that you tend not to see people writing about, certainly in books or journal or anthology pieces. That's starting to change, of course, but it strikes me that scholarship has been relatively slow to move to this kind of filmmaking. And I suppose along the way today I'll say a few things about why I think that's so. Let me be clear that my title today, which I'll just remind you is Failing Women, Hollywood and its Chick Flick Audience, is not meant as a double entendre. In suggesting that Hollywood is failing women, I don't mean to imply that the failure is on women for allowing this state of affairs. When you watch a lot of female-centered media representations, you get used to this sort of formulation. But I want to emphatically reject it. Failing Women doesn't carry the same implication, then, as the title of Judging Amy, the former legal and domestic drama whose female protagonist metes out justice in her courtroom and whose personal decision-making is in turn judged by series viewers. Nor that of Raising Helen, a film in which the presumptive immaturity of the career-minded protagonist is corrected when she inherits 3 children and marries a minister. The version of failure I am interested in is the failure of contemporary Hollywood to take seriously the interests of its female audience. The chick flick category feels more and more formulaic and impoverished, even while its commercial clout, exemplified in summer 2008 by hits like Sex and the City, Mamma Mia, and Baby Mama, all of which I think I have illustrations of in the handout, remains strong. A sign, I believe, of the conspicuous interest of female moviegoers in representations of the struggle to cultivate and maintain intimacy. When I went to see Sex and the City during its event opening last summer, I witnessed the first theatrical display of rapt, avid consumption that I'd seen in years, probably since like one of the Star Wars films, probably. A happy murmur went through the audience as the familiar series theme music began to play. However, the spectators' proficiency with the text exceeded simple gestures of recognition. Exclamations of delight could be heard in the cinema when early on Carrie arrives home and, searching for her partner, calls out, "John," a moment that could pass for trivial to the unfamiliar viewer, but to those who interpreted Sex and the City's refusal throughout its series life to name Carrie's long-term boyfriend as anything other than Mr. Big, as a sign that her relationship with him was always unequal and unstable, this was an auspicious moment. I've got a cold, so I'm going to sip this lemonade. The thrill that went through the Sex and the City audience that day at the apparently straightforward action of a familiar heroine addressing her male partner by name resonates in a larger context. It speaks of and for a broad range of female filmgoers whose interests are poorly served by the current cinema and who are looking to be meaningfully interpolated and to have the power to interpolate. It is not my project today to argue for the undetected artistic or ideological genius of the chick flick. I suppose some of you will be relieved. The term itself, it seems to me, refers increasingly to a set of films that are transparently emotionally unconvincing. And I'm also not interested in parsing distinctions between the degrees of awfulness exhibited by the likes of Bride Wars and Confessions of a Shopaholic. What I want to do is pose a prosaic but I think important 2-part question. What do chick flicks do and what should we do with them? While postfeminism presupposes the obsolescence of any feminist critical project, I aim to show that feminist tools are necessary now more than ever, and are essential for any kind of engagement with chick flicks and the culture that sustains them. In film studies, the assignation of the term chick flick has tended to reference a set of films deemed not to require critical consideration. A significant number of film studies scholars are still invested in assessing the quality of films in relation to the critical and cultural esteem in which their directors are held. And this further excludes the chick flick, whose association with anonymous or hack directors thus also delegitimizes it for some critics and theorists. But it wouldn't take much to slightly expand our definition of the chick flick to encompass other kinds of films, such as, for instance, this year in Ireland anyway, this year's Rachel Getting Married, the UK reviews of which almost uniformly opened with a reassurance to prospective viewers that the film was not a chick flick. A female-centered, female-scripted, family-oriented film about an affluent suburban wedding starring Anne Hathaway, Rachel Getting Married might be seen to deal with rawer emotions than most chick flicks, but I suspect the classificatory issue here is more closely tied to the prestige of the film's author. Why can't we envision a director like Jonathan Demme directing a chick flick? What drives the distaste for any such idea? In light of these issues, I want to argue that film studies should be talking more about the contemporary industry's deep reluctance to treat adult female audience interests in a serious way. That reluctance is validated by a post-feminist cultural environment that often positions women's interests as banal and cheap, and in which suspiciously hostile or blatantly self-promotional commentary on feminism is frequently packaged as serious feminist political writing. As I've argued elsewhere, there is a clear paradox at work in the way that women's interests and pleasures are simultaneously commercially privileged and pejoratively conceptualized. While some of the most high-profile films of 2008 were essentially elaborate showcases for male angst, I'm thinking about Iron Man and The Dark Knight, the chick flick, the cinematic form most directly and consistently fashioned to attract female spectators, has now come to be defined by what A.O. Scott has identified as a lack of emotional risk, and struggles to conceptualize egalitarian relationships of even the most rudimentary kind. Even as the industry becomes fitfully aware of new audience formations and constituencies such as Twilight moms, it rigidly adheres to a stunted imaginative brief when it comes to depicting women. Our experiences, interests, concerns, and dilemmas come across as depressingly conceptually unvaried and run through the following formulae again and again. And at this stage of my remarks, I'm just going to highlight a couple things that I think chick flicks do as kind of as a matter of course. But maybe just one last comment, which I sort of can't resist on the sort of summer releases of 2008. In what was celebrated by some as the superhero summer of 2008, wealthy technophile heroes operated consistently as sort of symbolic adventure capitalists. These characters, I'm thinking about Iron Man and Dark Knight specifically, stand in interesting juxtaposition to the female hyper-consumers of the chick flick, fortifying a gendered production and consumption divide. And at the risk, I guess, of sounding like Carrie Bradshaw, I can't help wondering if these seemingly contrastive sets of representations don't also hold quite a bit in common. Dedicated as they are to producing something at all costs, the adventure capitalists of Iron Man and The Dark Knight wind up producing themselves. And the techniques that they rely on, interestingly enough, are largely those of the makeover. I mean, this is really sort of extreme makeover territory. At the center of both of these groups of films, then, is also a strong sense of intimacy loss. And it's at that level that I'm going to want to talk more about the chick flick as I proceed. So, back to this kind of brief and not 100% comprehensive list of some of the things that the chick flick likes to do. First of all, the chick flick likes to depict women who find their femininity through acts of consumption. Accordingly, commodities must be put to use in an intense, ongoing staging of the self. When this dynamic gets repudiated, as it is in Sex and the City, it is only because Carrie's affiliations with the female world of fashion have crowded out Big's patronage, which is restored in the image of the resplendent closet that is the scene for the couple's reunion. If there's one unremitting idea in the contemporary chick flick, it is that social value is based on spending power. As problematic as this is, there is a further wrinkle. The films hold little faith in women's earnings as a basis for spending power, not because they dispute the reality that women can and do earn the sums required to purchase luxury commodities, high-end real estate or swanky holidays, but because in the world of the chick flick, spending power achieved in this way is deemed to be emotionally hollow and fundamentally illegitimate, while the heroine whose spending comes about through a male patron is doubly validated. This sort of obsessive investment in consumer culture has had much to do with the undoing of feminism, as Angela McRobbie has argued in The Aftermath of Feminism, a book that came out the end of last summer. The mandatory concession of the working woman seems to me to be another kind of trope of the contemporary chick flick. The concession narratives of the contemporary chick flick stand in marked difference to the more equal allocations of gendered power that marked precedent forms such as the screwball comedy. Now professional achievement for women has to be accounted for, as it is automatically understood to be a compensation activity of some kind. In other words, the professional heroines of this form of cinema are always suspect, right? Something's wrong if they're successful. In order to earn romance, the female protagonist must repudiate her profession, downsize her ambition, or retire, which is what happens in films like You've Got Mail, Someone Like You, 2 Weeks' Notice, The Accidental Husband, more lately with Uma Thurman. This conceptualization has been furthered in a set of films that David Denby has pinpointed as slacker-striver romances. I'm guessing that maybe some of you have seen this piece in The New Yorker, maybe? I'll tell you what he argues in any case, for those who haven't. Basically, Denby's account says that the female striver of recent cinema deludes herself that her working life is meaningful and rewarding, while the male slacker, in an act of moral heroism, opts out of the corrupt and shallow corporate sphere. As Denby notes, the perilous new direction of the slacker-striver genre reduces the role of women to vehicles. Their only real function is to make men grow up. The rehabilitation of the misguided professional woman continues in a variety of forms of popular culture. And I guess somewhat perversely today, in a talk about the chick flick, I'm not going to show you a single clip from a chick flick, but I'm going to show you instead an advertisement. And this advertisement was absolutely ubiquitous in Britain and Ireland for about the first 3 months of this year. Every time you went to the cinema, you saw this ad before the feature. What you're going to see is, sorry, I'm kind of really got a cold today, but I'm trying to project, so if you can't hear me, just say so. Basically what you're going to see in this ad in just a moment, this is a kind of a partnership between Emirates Airlines and Australian tourism. And it trades very heavily on the rehabilitation of the misguided professional woman. My point is that we get this plot in a lot of forms of popular culture, so that in a way we see chick flick plots becoming so culturally familiar that they bleed outside of that category, and they're very influential in television and other forms too. So this piece, as you'll see in just a minute, is also designed to co-promote Australia, the film that Baz Luhrmann directed. It's a pretty bad film, as some of you will be familiar with, but this ad came along as an update of the Tourism Australia's previous campaign, which was very aggressively and bluntly formatted. Its tagline was, "So where the bloody hell are you?" And for this ad that you'll see in a moment, they decided to go a different way, clearly trying to target female tourists. And here the tagline is, "It's easy to find yourself in Australia with Emirates." So the idea being that you fly Emirates Airlines to Australia. I think maybe that's all I'll say before letting you see this ad. And maybe we'll play it twice so people can absorb it. Okay. I don't know, maybe once is enough? Did everybody get that? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe, did anybody feel confused? Do you want to see it a second time? Or I really don't, but yeah, you'd like to see it?
No,
Got
I
it?
just didn't understand.
See, that's what I was, okay, so that I can explain, but maybe once really is sufficient to, yeah. So,
Do you want her mournful face behind?
sure, why not? To understand the indigenous boy who we see in the ad, you would have had to have seen Baz Luhrmann's film Australia. He's a kind of a crossover character from that film. But the female character here is certainly not Nicole Kidman, but she is the sort of, the professional woman sui generis in a lot of popular culture texts, I think, of the current moment. And, what's at stake here is clearly the idea that this careerist woman in a major city, New York probably, has somehow, not somehow, I think for some fairly clear reasons, is shown as having this particular contemporary female dilemma, which is that her professional identity is seen to be incompatible with her selfhood, and that's why I think we get this transformation that she arrived in Australia as under her professional identity, and she leaves as Kate, right? That she's been baptized again, right? There's all the watery stuff here you can read, but I mean I think that the kind of sense that she is retrieving an essential female self is a kind of premier fantasy of these sorts of post-feminist texts. The other thing that I would just sort of briefly point out, and again, partly to answer any questions that folks would have if they haven't actually seen Australia, is that this ad reflects some of the textual complexities that are now operating, right? Because this is, on the one hand, an advertisement. That's what I'm referring to it as, but it's extending the narrative premise of the feature to which it is tied, in which Australia is represented as a place where Nicole Kidman's protagonist represents uppity women who can be transformed and maternalized. And Luhrmann has a track record in generating this sort of material, having directed another ad movie, as these kinds of bits of text are called. This one for Chanel No. 5, the film, which was an extension of the kind of diegesis of Moulin Rouge a few years ago. And Paul Grange at the University of Nottingham has written really nicely about these kinds of textual hybrids. For instance, he says, in a period where media boundaries have become less circumscribed, branded entertainment is suggestive of a cultural landscape where cinematic encounters and determinants of film art and practice have become more fluid. Right? So what do we do with this kind of text? It's an ad. Yes, it's an ad on the one hand for Tourism Australia and for Emirates Airlines. It's also an ad for Australia, the film. Right? It maintains an interesting textual complexity. But for our purposes, I think the really important thing is that it does something that chick flicks do over and over and over again, which is to pathologize the professional woman and prevent her with a fantasy scenario in which she can retrieve her essential selfhood. Another way in which this happens, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, in the chick flick is through what I call the Procreative Epiphany, right? 2007 and 2008 saw the emergence of a set of fertility comedies and dramas that include some of the ones on your handout: Knocked Up, Juno, Waitress, all unified by the belief that even under adverse circumstances, young, working class, or marginally employed white women's fertility is a cultural resource that must be carefully managed. The reliance on the procreative epiphany gambit as a gesture of closure in female-centered films speaks to a culture unwilling to surrender belief that motherhood is female destiny, and possibly anxiously reassuring itself of its own continuation. Films like Waitress and Premonition, the remake of The Women, and the otherwise tart Four Christmases rely on procreation as an all-purpose solution to relationship trouble and life course uncertainty, and as a limp gesture of narrative conclusion. The correlative here is that determined women are likely to be driven by a righteous maternity in films like, films as varied as Changeling, the Spanish horror film The Orphanage, the American remake of The Ring, these kinds of films. As filmmakers seem unable to conceptualize any other imperative for female tenacity. And even last summer's The X-Files' I Want to Believe, in so many ways a feminist tour de force, suffers from this hindrance. A film very unfairly reviewed, in my opinion. Distinctions between girlhood and womanhood also collapse in the contemporary chick flick. In some ways, this was most evidently showcased in the film that has now become the best-selling DVD of all time in Britain. 1 in every 4 UK households owns a copy of this film, and the film is Mamma Mia. Early on in this movie, I'm wondering how many of you would have seen Mamma Mia? Okay. Early on in the film, for those of you who have seen it, mother and daughter each greet groups of visiting friends on the Greek island where they've been living. And what's important, I think, about these greeting scenes is that they're so strongly paralleled. And the point here, it seems to me, is that midlife women and girls behave exactly the same way. They scream, they sing, they do, you know. But I mean, that kind of moment, I think, really emblematizes this kind of collapsing. We don't quite know what to do with adult women. I'll say more about that in just a minute. So films like Mamma Mia, as well as Enchanted and 13 Going on 30, reveal how conceptually blurred girls and women have become in the current cinema, and how disinterested popular film is at present in accounts of female adulthood that don't comply with this remit. The terrain of female adulthood has become deeply ideologically uncertain in a post-feminist era that manifests fundamental, ongoing discomfort with mature women. And interestingly enough, as I was sort of thinking about these remarks, we have a very interesting case this week, an import case from Britain's Got Talent. And I feel fairly sure that most of you have been exposed to this YouTube clip of a woman named Susan Boyle, who appeared in a well-known British reality program. And what actually, in a conversation we had just yesterday, Brenda and I talked about as a drama of post-feminist exceptionalism, crafted around this woman whose failure to comport herself according to normative codes of femininity seemed to generate shudders of revulsion in the audience for Britain's Got Talent until she began to sing. And whether and how Boyle will continue to flout these codes is an open question. But the spectacle of an unattractive midlife woman claiming visibility has thus far proved compelling. And I think, you know, whatever this case does, it's an interesting one, certainly. One of the other things that chick flicks do again and again is that they transfigure women's dissatisfactions under patriarchy into acrimony, or sometimes mock acrimony, between women. The execrable bride wars, you have an image of that on the handout, is dedicated to this, in my view. But also films like Iron Man, which is, of course, not a chick flick unless you want to take up that point I made earlier. But in Iron Man, Christine Everhart, the sharp-witted, tenacious, Ivy League-educated journalist who interrogates Tony in an early scene, goes to bed with him and awakens to find herself the object of a rather well-established dispatching routine in which Tony's assistant, Gwyneth Paltrow's Pepper Potts, hands her things and effectively shows her the door. And the exchange between them runs like this. This is Paltrow's character. I have your clothes here. They've been dry cleaned and pressed, and there's a car waiting for you outside that will take you anywhere you'd like to go. You must be the famous Pepper Potts. Indeed I am. After all these years, Tony still has you picking up the dry cleaning. I do anything and everything Mr. Stark requires, including occasionally taking out the trash. Will that be all? Pepper's dignified-sounding rejoinder to Christine's jibe about her menial role, enjoyable enough to the film's fans that it is cited in the dialogue quote section of the film's entry in IMDb, consists of telling the other woman that she is trash, or trashy, whichever you like, and the film anticipates our agreement, drawing together Christine's educational credentials, her assertiveness, her implicit feminism, as Tony has referred to her earlier quite distinctly as Ms. Everhart, and what we are invited to deem her promiscuity, so that our judgment extends in numerous directions at once. This astonishing early exchange is the only one of its kind in the film. From this point forward, Pepper's role is that of devoted helpmate to Tony, and indeed, with the reporter's early departure, we lose virtually the only other dialogue-speaking female character other than Pepper Potts. It is important that Christine's unruliness and her political and moral awareness are barred from the world of the film by Pepper, whose presence as a glamorous post-feminist accessory figure is really the only form of femininity that the film is prepared to tolerate. Two other points about the chick flick. I think it'll probably not have escaped people's attention that the chick flick is currently undergoing a shift to male psychological centrality. If it's not already clear, I'm arguing that there are deeply distorted notions of intimacy at work in this form of cinema. For the past 15 years, the chick flick has been marked by a pronounced chastity. Its protagonist couples secure deep and permanent emotional bonds through a magic kiss or a magic hand clasp, but they rarely sleep together. In Someone Like You, just to vary things, they take a magic nap and they wake up in love. In recent years, as the chick flick has increasingly been grafted with male-oriented sex comedy, I think the harbinger of this format was probably Something About Mary in 1998, the chicks in chick flicks have been even more problematically rendered. And in films like Definitely Maybe and Maid of Honor, there are other examples you could probably put in there as well, they're maintaining a passive presence in the narrative and a distant relationship to the audience. Lastly, and this really takes us outside of the sort of narrative universes of the chick flick into the sort of broader culture broader discursive culture of Hollywood film and film stars. It's become common for female stars to discursively deprioritize their working lives in the interviews they give and the press that supports their film releases. In the celebrity news culture that underwrites Hollywood filmmaking, female stars continually testify to the relative unimportance of their creative and professional lives. The most current trend, I think, is for top-draw female stars like Nicole Kidman and Angelina Jolie to elaborate on this by discussing how they intend to curtail their careers sooner rather than later. They don't talk about the fact that Hollywood has trouble casting women as they age. They talk about their own disinterest and their great devotion to family. On the rare occasions when a male star behaves similarly, his retirement is designed to give him the opportunity to succeed in another realm rather than to retreat to a private domestic life. And I think that's what Joaquin Phoenix intends, even though it's a bit strange, but I think, it just really kind of in a way illustrates that the habit of moving on to a different realm as opposed to retiring and what I call in the book retreating. We use the term chick flick to designate a set of films that enjoy great cultural familiarity, but it is a familiarity that is almost always acknowledged with embarrassment or chagrin, and often a poorly considered set of assumptions about commercial clout. For some, the need for zealous defense of blockbuster territory as a male preserve was expressed in pre-release disparagement directed against Sex and the City, a film Ramin Sotoudeh rightly identified in Newsweek as the first tentpole blockbuster to rest squarely on a female demographic. As Sotoudeh goes on to note, male posters flooded IMDb with votes in order to ensure that the film would open with a puny 3 rating on a 10-point scale, although the film's viewers later substantially raised its rating. Existing analysis of chick flicks is limited by assumptions that their audience is satisfied with them, which I strongly suggest they may not be. The habit of taking spectatorial satisfaction with these films for granted is reflective, perhaps, of a broader patriarchal tendency to assume female pleasure in the absence of any direct evidence. Meanwhile, Hollywood operates in a state of perpetual surprise when it comes to the spending power of its female audience. At present, it is largely left to popular press critics and journalistic reviewers to note this state of affairs and to suggestively comment on it. The broad-based neglect of these gendered, industrial, and representational dynamics is a failure film studies scholars can and should redress. Another reason that film studies scholars should exert themselves to critically engage with the chick flick is that despite its manifest failings, it remains our premier intimacy genre. At the heart of this film form is a desire to establish intimacy, nearly always, of course, in the form of heterosexual marriage, in contexts that underscore the precarious place of women in an era dominated by monopoly capitalism and the breakdown of the social contract. This longing for intimacy is currently manifesting itself in interesting ways in the chick flick horror hybrid. Notably, I think the vampire romance franchises, not only of Twilight in cinema, but True Blood on HBO. Along with some of the time travel fictions of recent years, such as Kate and Leopold, The Lake House, as well as the upcoming Time Traveler's Wife, these texts hold in common the search for historical modes of intimacy and an impulse to transcend and evade contemporary gender mores. Given the conditions of commercial plenitude and representational impoverishment that currently characterize the chick flick, what kinds of critical practices can aerate these stultifying narrative universes? And how might such practices be drawn more fully into the mainstream of film studies, rather than shunted off to the niche space still regularly accorded to analyses of gender, class, and consumerism? The answers broached to such questions at present often feel very tentative and inadequate. In an article in Britain's The Guardian in February of 2009, Kira Cochran noted the contempt the chick flick regularly exhibits for its audience. She's certainly right on this. When we revisit the chick flicks even of 10 years ago, exemplified in hits like Runaway Bride or You've Got Mail, we can see that they treat their heroines more respectfully, if still unsatisfactorily. I think maybe for me, maybe a recent kind of low point is Confessions of a Shopaholic, in which the heroine imagines that boutique mannequins speak to her, which seems fitting because her subjectivity is about at that level. I mean, there really is a sense of incredible shallowness in how these protagonists are currently being drawn. Cochrane fruitlessly inventories the gender of recent chick flicks' creative personnel in the mistaken belief that the placement of more women in key production roles would alleviate the genre's current problems. She seems unaware that female studio executives, producers, writers, and to a lesser extent directors are actually reasonably well represented in this category of filmmaking. I wouldn't want to overstate this. But over the last 15 years, it has been a truism in Hollywood that when powerful female stars form production companies, they are most likely to finance and produce chick flick material. Although I'm by no means disinterested in the question of industrial gender equity, I don't think we can expect that the cultural problems the chick flick articulates will be resolved by ensuring that women are filling key creative roles. Again, let me just be clear, I'm certainly not arguing against their being in these key creative roles. Women in the industry are just as adherent to truisms about profit and formula as their male counterparts. And a female screenwriter, for instance, is no guarantee against cliche-ridden material, as is richly evidenced in Cecilia Ahern's P.S. I Love You, if anybody saw that. Set in Ireland. Even celebrated mavericks like Diablo Cody, who wrote Juno, may produce work that is far from free of dominant ideological positioning. Having said this, in recent years, the chick flick has also developed the habit of raising feminist concerns and pungent asides. In Bride Wars, Candice Bergen's wedding planner, Marion St. Clair, tells her protagonist clients, "A wedding marks the first day of the start of your life. You're dead right now. Do you realize that? Dead." Her comments acerbically pinpoint the social visibility that luxury consumerism and marriage confer on women in a post-feminist culture. Similarly, in Sex and the City, Miranda observes that the only two costume choices for women at Halloween are Witch and Sexy Kitten. Do you remember this? It was in the trailer. To which Carrie rejoins, "You just said a mouthful there, sister." Though it is in keeping with the film's overall ideological positioning that it quickly moves on to other concerns, and the implications of such an insight will never be brought forward or influence the unfolding action. Miranda, for instance, will spend considerable time in the film reflecting on how she may have been at fault for her husband's infidelity. So I don't think that necessarily takes the film in a different direction. And I want to kind of distinguish these moments where feminist concern enters the world of the film briefly, only then to sort of be swept aside, from another kind of witticism that we get in a lot of chick flicks. And they also tend to come up in the trailers. We saw one last night, for example, before watching Adventureland. I think the film's called The Proposal. Is it the Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds film that's coming out, in which an elderly woman gropes for Sandra Bullock's breasts while she's wearing an oversized wedding gown, and it says, "Oh, it's like an Easter egg hunt." And you know, that kind of, I don't think that's a feminist aside in any possible way, but it does reflect the conjunction of older women and sexuality as always being an already established kind of a joke. So I want to make a distinction between those kinds of asides and these others that I referenced. Though it can sometimes generate shrewd assessments of capitalism and pose significant questions about for whose likely benefit it operates, the chick flick normally closes with an acquiescence, sometimes strained, to the economic and social status quo. It remains in many ways the preeminent narrative form for securing social definitions of such vexed and uncertain concepts as intimacy, family, and the ever-feminized work-life balance. Because the film and TV fictions we consume help to write social consensus around these subjects, they require our careful scrutiny and not just our reflexive distaste. This seems to me a very opportune moment for reconsidering the mandates of feminist cultural studies. This year, the need for a supple, informed, and politically engaged feminism was nowhere better illustrated than in the stunt candidacy of Sarah Palin for the vice presidency of the United States. But distorted renditions of feminism proliferate more widely than this, and the gambit that led John McCain to put a woman he barely met on the Republican ticket was in many respects a logical extension of the kinds of maneuvers that are regularly made in a gendered popular culture environment in which retrograde figures and scenarios are put across as progressive and innovative. And in this vein, I would cite perhaps the most unlikely film to exhibit feminist flourishes this year, which is Zack and Miri Make a Porno. You have an image from it in your handout. Zack and Miri Make a Porno is now called Zack and Miri in its DVD format. Kevin Smith's film embeds a highly romantic portrayal of its protagonist couple, who discover their love for one another while having filmed sex in front of a group of relative strangers. But this is also a film in which the nudity is equal opportunity. Sexual gratification is understood to be equally important to women and men. And the happily ever after couple take each other's last names upon marriage. It presents itself, in short, as something of an egalitarian romance, more egalitarian anyway than Bride Wars or The Women. However, the film's love story works only if you fully suspend any feminist objection to pornography, and the film proceeds as if it has every expectation that we will. Zack and Miri's romance is a form of salvation from strip mall despair and a digital culture that often appropriates and diminishes selfhood and vigorously polices sexual roles. When two boys record Miri changing clothes and post the tape online, she briefly becomes an internet sensation as Granny Panties. You can make whatever connections you want to Susan Boyle. Famous for her non-compliance with post-feminist sartorial expectations. A robust feminist critical practice should acknowledge the appeal of a film like this one, whose emphasis on entrepreneurial ingenuity turned out to be well-timed for the emerging economic recession, and whose modifications of the slacker-striver formula felt innovative to some audiences. But it should also note how the characterization of Miri flattens out as the film progresses, and it must insist that the film's flirtation with the mainstreaming of pornography can't be squared with any meaningful claims to egalitarianism. Apart from continuing to demonstrate that feminist critical tools are vitally necessary, feminist cultural studies should also be preparing for what will surely be some innovation in the chick flick category. I wouldn't want to overstate this, and some forms of industry sexism obviously continue to flourish. But the financial crisis has the potential to trouble the rigid gender and class hierarchies that have anchored the form in recent years, and maybe I would add to release it from its hyper-consumerism. I think that's probably going to have to happen, at least a little bit. There are few signs of this as yet, I'll admit, although the Jerry Bruckheimer-produced Confessions of a Shopaholic, released on Valentine's Day and promoted using the tagline, "For the credit you deserve," in a staggeringly mistimed bit of promotion, reportedly went into reshoots to formulate an ending more sensitive to the current financial climate. However, films like Beverly Hills Chihuahua look increasingly ill-judged culturally as well as creatively, while the two films from 2008 that might represent harbingers of more interesting and substantial narrative formulae also worked from the fullest definitions of intimacy. And for those who came with us last night to see Adventureland, I think I might want to add Adventureland to this list, but I'm not sure yet. But the two films I have in mind are In Search of a Midnight Kiss and Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist. Both of which present the couple as a fragile bulwark against a disorienting and hostile social sphere. The tentative yet rich connections at play in both films represent a form of emotional honesty the chick flick would do well to emulate. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's probably right, that a lot of the most recent films are kind of inching in that direction, and they don't even keep up the pretense anymore. And that in itself is an incredibly significant turn. They're not trying to kid anybody. And in fact, there was a paper at the conference that both Brenda and I attended that made this argument to some extent about the Real Housewives franchise. You know, that series is not trying to keep up any kind of really, that its representations of intimacy are again openly false and insubstantial, and that reward, and to the extent that there is a kind of sense of the meaningful, it resides elsewhere. I think the thing about Baby Mama that's so striking is its class politics, which are so ugly, right? That the film sort of pretends to broach a class boundary, but then, you know, concludes by firmly reinstating that boundary. But I think you're right that in that film and lots of others, and I would like to think that maybe some of this was suggested in some of these remarks, that the search for intimacy doesn't have to run only through the quest for a male partner. That search is kind of more open. And the bromance films are doing this too in interesting ways. So it may be that we're seeing a moment. I think that the chick flick, as I said briefly, has become so impoverished. It's just a sense of like, okay, well maybe we can afford some experimentation here because the form is so completely rote at this point. And it seems like the way in which that's happening again is sort of same-sex intimacy. In a sexual sense, not usually, in an emotional sense sometimes, which is, in a way, maybe a step forward from the female friendships of let's say, 10 years ago, where it was automatic that the female friendship fell apart when the ideal romance was achieved.
some of these
Yeah,
qualities?
that's a really interesting question, and I'm afraid I'm probably guilty of just stepping over an analysis of the medium-specific qualities in these texts. But you're exactly right, I think, to draw attention to the increasingly synergistic way in which we are kind of consuming these texts, and I think the rise of post-feminist chick franchises, right, in which, let's say, there's a best-selling book that is then adapted, or I think maybe the ultimate example of this is He's Just Not That Into You, which is which was an advice book, a best-selling advice book based on an episode of Sex and the City, which has now been made. I'm getting it wrong. Sex and the City, right, has this sort of famous little bit where a male guest character says, "Well, maybe he's just not that into you." That becomes the basis for a best-selling advice book written by one of the series writers, and then that in turn becomes a film. And so the capacity of this stuff to shapeshift seems to be growing. And I guess one of the things that I think is really important is to keep in mind the repeated consumption in various formats, which I think is really the most important thing, the pre-selling, the familiarity, the sense that I think I write about it briefly in What a Girl Wants, that this textual material operates kind of like as an echo chamber. And I'm not meaning to discount the medium-specific qualities, but I think maybe in a way for me what's more important is just the greater pattern of synergistic reinforcement that seems to be playing out in a lot of them. That's right, yeah, that's it. But her more important role, I think, is to be a political wife and to give him street cred, right? But it's a really weird use of Ray Fiennes, I think. He looks deeply uncomfortable through the whole film. But yeah, no, I'm glad you raised that point. I mean, a little bit. I haven't thought about it that much, and I will now. I mean, I think the one sort of film of this kind that I've talked to students about is Bride and Prejudice, but I think that may be a little bit anomalous for all sorts of reasons, and it may be that the economic and class issues are quite different. But I'm aware that in Britain, as here, that there's starting to be more segmentation of the market, and that's one important way, I think, in which the market is segmenting. But at the same time, this stuff is also so weirdly universalized. It's hard for me to imagine that much differentiation. Do you think it's there? Yeah. Well, I guess I would say, let's say, just maybe slightly reducing your question, that I think we talked about this a bit yesterday because we saw a trailer for a new Jennifer Garner film. This is the one with Matthew McConaughey. And I was thinking that how interesting it is that female stars associated for playing, kind of kick-ass heroines on TV, whether it's an Alias or Buffy the Vampire Slayer or what have you, when they appear in the chick flick, they go flat, and that flat affect is certainly kind of key to the genre at many times. But it strikes me that in the kind of suspense thriller, women's sexuality, it often works very differently to the way that it works in the chick flick, and the chastity of the chick flick could be contrasted pretty forcibly with the way in which, let's say, the female-centered suspense drama of the last 15 or 20 years usually at some point needs to sexually endanger the heroine. And so it's a world of kind of, dark eroticism in comparison to the sexuality of the chick flick. And it's almost as if we shunted over there to a world in which danger and jeopardy really take center stage. So just very briefly to answer what I think is a really useful but immense question, my sense is that maybe this is one of the ways in which current codes for representing femininity are breaking down into kind of generic patterns. Well, I guess I think that when I teach the chick flick, I try to muck up that term, because I think it's really important, let's say, if you're teaching, particularly in an undergraduate course, to say, well, actually, we've always had chick flicks, however you want to stretch that term, and I would rather make it elastic, but in the contemporary period, I think the very late 80s, early 90s, when Harry Met Sally, Pretty Woman, I think that's kind of a hinge point. But then within that, let's say now 20 years, I see the films as getting much more brutal in the way that they treat women, much more, the branded nature of the worlds that they try to summon is extraordinary. I think probably more extraordinary than other film forms in different ways. I mean, if you think about that montage, for example, in the middle of the film of Sex and the City, where Carrie tries on different designer gowns and is very careful to name each one, that sort of thing. I guess that there seems to be. As that kind of, what I'm arguing is this kind of uncertainty about intimacy and the desire to find it somewhere deepens, the films get colder. And maybe at their worst, the only thing that they really believe in is capitalist relations. So, in Confessions of a Shopaholic, the heroine, when she realizes that the man that she's working with is the man for her, as it were, she says, "Oh, you speak Prada." And that's the moment when she realizes that they're simpatico. So I mean, that kind of sense in which there's a despair at the heart of these films, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think that despair has deepened to a point where it's hard to know how it progresses further when you got heroines talking to mannequins, and I don't see much of a difference between the two of them. Like where do you, so partly I'm wanting to sort of make these remarks in the hope that we'll get better films in the future, and with a tentative hope that maybe some of the more independent, less star-driven releases of the past year give us glimmers of that. It's not like me to be hopeful about chick flicks, but I actually do feel a little bit of that because I do, as I said at the close, I think that there's a way in which these films have gotten, their emotional coldness has been very much attached, I think, to a state of relations that really proliferated, let's say, between the late 90s and a year or so ago. Yeah, well, I mean, a very straightforward answer is because Hollywood is a formula business, and I think partly because we've reached a state of affairs where some of the women who might affect creative change in the industry are not doing that for whatever reason, although I wouldn't hold just women creative practitioners responsible for that. But I think the sheer formality, the sheer familiarity of this form accounts for a lot of it. And, as I said earlier, I'm kind of still thinking this through, but my sense is that there are a lot of bored audiences for these films, and yet they still keep going. And I find that paradox very interesting. Now, maybe at the level of, let's say, just simply daily life. I mean, if that's a space that you can claim, and if you don't see anything else at the multiplex that interests you, I mean, these films are very good at sort of, reaching out to their audience and sort of saying, you are the kind of, and also I see this a lot in Ireland, that women will go in groups to see these films. So I think they might represent a social space that's less about the film than about the opportunity to be out of the house, or to have a babysitter, or to see female friends, or whatever. So their social consumption is not something that I'm studying as such, but I'm just sort of suspecting that might play an important part also. But you've said something very important, and I think it is cyclical in the way that you describe. And again, I'd go back to that sort of idea of the pre-selling, again, the sort of the way in which these things are built into franchises. But what I'm not comfortable with is the assumption that these films work for their audiences. What I think is fascinating is that people still pay, but I don't necessarily think they're deriving as much pleasure as is assumed that they do from them, or that there aren't lots of conversations after seeing these kinds of films about how negotiated readings arise and the dissatisfactions that might come out of these films as well. Well, I think it's certainly clear that which I didn't even bother to talk about the centrality of weddings to this category of film, because I assume everybody knows that's so, and I wrote about it quite a bit in What a Girl Wants. But yeah, I mean, it seems pretty clear that a lot of the films, perhaps especially the 90s, were essential in offering, consumerist and lifestyle scripts. That's my argument anyway. But what I think is very interesting is, and this is certainly true for another generation of students, is that they can't imagine an era in which the extremely expensive luxury wedding wasn't the norm for everybody. But that didn't, that wasn't always so. And I think, like for me, The Father of the Bride remake in 1991 with Kimberly Williams and Steve Martin is the film that puts that vision across, just as the earlier set of Father of the Bride movies was essential in that era for defining what the middle-class wedding should be like. That film was equally important, I would say. And of course, it generated a template that lots of other films, Sweet Home Alabama, whatever it is, they're myriad. It's almost a kind of a stock element. Bride Wars takes that to a kind of, to a whole other degree. But I think that the way in which these films model how you live and ritualize middle class, largely white female identity is certainly a big part of the story.